Hello and welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle. I just got finished listening to the Half-Blood Prince with my son. It's been a long time since I've read or listened to that particular book. There's a lot I just didn't remember about that one, which I think was the fascinating thing about really exploring that particular book, is why is so much of it really forgettable, entirely on a personal level, maybe the experience of other people, but I think it's worth really exploring what really makes it forgettable. It's really the first half that's forgettable, up to the cave scene. And spoilers for this, of course, if that's the purpose of watching this video. Just a spoiler-free review of a book from decades ago. But I just re-listening to it. That was sort of the inquiry I had, was why was that first half really forgettable? Because ultimately, I think that's the thing you don't want to be, just. And I think that's part of the problem with a lot of the way that people teach creative writing, in the textbooks and the classes and things like that. Essentially, what they're doing is teaching writers to be forgettable, to be good but forgettable, to be good but bland and unchallenging and what have you. That's kind of the point I was trying to make with my rambling about 90s westerns. I'm not sure if I ever came to that point, but that was kind of the point I was trying to make, through the chaos. That was a weirdly cursed episode. But what you want to be is, on the one hand, you could be unforgiven. You can be lauded by critics. You could be beloved of, most of the artistic community for your achievement in filmmaking and what have you. Or you could be dead man, sort of under the radar, but still just highly beloved of critics. Really rememberable for just how unique it is. I mean, Unforgiven follows a lot of the tropes. It subverts a lot of the tropes. Follows the theme and variation. And I think Harry Potter's an interesting one to look at, just because how it takes the theme and variation and really boils it down to really 7 variations on the same basic structure of a story. Whereas a Western, there's thousands of those, just maybe millions, I don't know. Or, so you can be, on the one hand, Dead Man or Unforgiven. On the other hand, you could be Wild Wild West and just trying all kinds of crazy stuff. Lots of really bad ideas playing out. But it's a memorable movie, absolutely a memorable movie. Entertaining, not necessarily for very traditional concepts of what makes a good film, but extraordinarily entertaining, very watchable, very memorable. What you don't want to be is Maverick, just the sort of blandly okay-ish, middling, not doing much new, just kind of following what's old, but just kind of forgettable. And, just presuming that's what you want to be. So what makes something forgettable versus really memorable? So if I were submitting something like a Western, or if I was submitting a Harry Potter book to a workshop, if they said, "Oh, this is great based on this standard," fine. If they said, "Oh, I hate this," if they had real strong opinions against it, I would be perfectly fine with that. At least I'm trying something different. I more than likely, I'm more in the Wild Wild West spectrum, but that doesn't bother me a bit, because I'm trying something a bit different. Not that different is a universal standard, it's just that different, trying something different than the just the cliche, just the standard formula, can end up making it more memorable. But you could still follow a pattern and make it really memorable. So, just in the pattern of the first few Harry Potter books, J.K. Rowling establishes the pattern in Sorcerer's Stone. And a lot of Sorcerer's Stone's kind of derivative of other stories, but it's really well done. And then in the second one, it's almost too close to that pattern, just in my personal experience. Not really my favorite one, almost too close to that pattern. But then she really gets it right, in my opinion. She really gets it right with number 3, where she takes a lot of the same sort of pattern. She gives it something very new, changes up the story structure quite a bit from the first 2, introduces all these different factors that sort of subvert the storytelling. And then in 4, she sort of takes the formula, ramps it up tremendously, and does everything in number 4. And then number 5, again, she gets it really right. And just in my opinion, 3 and 5 are really the best ones. But the theme and variation, the big variation that tends to come along is the defense against the dark arts professor. Plus whatever mystery, those are the main things, just the way the mystery really pans out. But you have little elements, and I think this is kind of a sign of where we are by this book. You have little elements like the Quidditch match. By number 4, the way the theme and variation worked is the Quidditch matches are kind of the same. Book 1 and book 2, the Quidditch match, the sort of story element with the Quidditch match was kind of the same. Harry just gets hurt. Book 3, it's a bit different. It's with the Dementors. Book 4, it sort of blows up the Quidditch-ness of the book tremendously. Book 5 finds, so it's ramping up each time. Book 5 finds a different thing to do with it, with the whole Ron subplot. But Half-Blood Prince kind of forgets about the Quidditch. It has a different plot with the Quidditch. It sort of abandons ramping up and goes with sort of different subplots with that. And it just kind of peters out. But I think the defense against the dark arts teacher, that's one of the theme and variation elements where, each one is very unique. And each one is really integral to the plot. But this one, I was trying to remember who the defense against the dark arts teacher was. And I was thinking, it's the Jim Broadbent guy. And I just blanked. I mean, so much of this book was so forgettable, but he ends up being the potions teacher. And, I forgot that whole subplot. There's so much of the plot that I just totally forgot. But Jim Broadbent is sort of that same role of the defense against the dark arts teacher, that new sort of quirky character. He's an interesting character, kind of a Dickensian, lush sort of character. He's an interesting character. I mean, I don't know why necessarily he's forgettable. And the whole plot is pretty good. I mean, I was just surprised because I thought it was forgettable because maybe it was just kind of bland and not very, very good. But just re-listening to it, it's better than I remembered it being. But I think the biggest factor in making it forgettable, here's the key. Not necessarily that it's so similar to the other plots. I mean, certainly there are elements, and it's not just like the Quidditch thing where they ramp it up each time and then they just sort of peter out. That's one of the elements, but I think it's the lack of present danger. I think that's a big part of it. So even when you have a defense against the dark arts teacher like in book 2, Gilderoy Lockhart, who's not really central to the plot necessarily, still that plot is there's a monster in the castle who's going to eat people. This one, it was Malfoy had some sort of plan, and it was just really nebulous what his plan was. The climax was great, but just his plan was so nebulous, and nobody believed him. And it's at this point in the book that was kind of hard to swallow. I have cats running around all over the place. Hey, Bo, what's that? Did you like Harry Potter book 6? So anyway, you have Harry trying to figure out what Malfoy's plan is, but I think a lot of that was kind of forgettable. I mean, it's fine, it's well plotted and all that, but I think a lot of that was kind of forgettable because we've dealt with Malfoy 5 books for now. He's always done something bad. Why do people not believe Harry when he says Malfoy's up to something? That's a little bit of a stretch there. But I think a lot of it was the lack of real present danger. There are little elements like the poisoning things. But Slughorn really had no connection to present danger. So much of the plot was about just the background of Voldemort. A lot of it was really displaced in memory. And I think that's a big key factor. It was certainly, a lot of it was, it's sort of like half of the book was exposition dump, and that was it. It's an interesting story. I mean, the Voldemort story works well. But a lot of it is forgettable because it's so displaced inside of memories. So then that first half of the book, once you get to the cave, the spoiler alerts, you have a cave crossing, you have zombies, you have And it's just works so well. I mean, it's such an extreme difference from the first half to the second half. Just the total lack of present danger, and sort of the danger being kind of bland and sort of a feeling kind of like a forced danger, just from my personal perspective, uh, as compared to the cave where it's very, very dangerous. You have zombies all over the place. You have Dumbledore getting super vulnerable. I think one of my favorite. I mean, it's some of my favorite scenes in the whole series, just in that sequence from the cave to the tower scene. Um, Dumbledore begging to not have to drink the thing anymore. You know, some of my favorite stuff. It's like so intensely emotional, so intensely vulnerable. Um, that it makes up for the first half certainly, and I think that's a schema issue. I would diagnose the forgettableness of the first half as a schema issue. So if you check the handy dandy rainbow circle, the center is the visceral stimulation based on elimination of the barrier between self and other through empathetic experience of the character. So certainly things like the really intense visceral scenes like the tower, absolutely just gut wrenching visceral stimulation. Dumbledore being so vulnerable, just so intensely vulnerable, and begging not to have to drink the thing anymore. One of my favorite scenes in the whole series, because it's so dark and bleak and dense and so densely emotional. Um, but yeah, you have that certainly, and you have the paradox. This very strong man, who's sort of the the reassurance that everything's going to be okay. Dumbledore's always there. He's become so intensely vulnerable. So the paradox is certainly playing out. The schema, I think, the reason why the first part is forgettable is because uh, it's set up this expectation that there would be present danger just constantly. So coming off of book 5, where you have such a fantastically constructed villain in Umbridge, and she's present in the castle, and you have Voldemort is out there. He's not really present necessarily all the time, but sort of in the dream, you have that sort of displaced variation of danger, sort of like in Half-Blood Prince, where in the dream there's this danger. It's a bit displaced. But you have this pattern of all of these different, you have 5 books in a row where most of the plot is that there's something really significantly dangerous going on in the castle. Somebody's trying to kill somebody. Even when, even in book 4, where it's much more mystery based, Harry's fighting dragons. What sort of dragons or whatever is he fighting in Half-Blood Prince? Not really any sort of absolute present danger. So yeah, I think setting up this expectation, and then most of that first part not really being, especially going from Umbridge to Slughorn. Umbridge is this, horrific presence in the castle, and Slughorn's just kind of wacky. So it's sort of a big step down in terms of just the intensity of the character. So Slughorn, not a bad character, but I think schematically you set up this expectation through this demon variation, this pattern in previous books, and by taking that step down, it makes Slughorn a bit more forgettable. Reducing the present danger in the castle makes much of it totally forgettable, but makes up for it totally in that second half, where it's absolutely this really intense present danger going on. But here's a factor that I don't talk about much, which is the psychological. So you go from visceral, paradoxical, schematic to psychological. Psychological involves a displacement from a supposedly real world, a concept of a real world, quote unquote real world, outside of the text, projecting into the text in an imaginary world. But you have multiple layers. So you can recognize the displacement of danger, where much of the text has that sort of psychological split, where much of it is going on inside of Harry's head and Dumbledore's head. So it displaces the danger to a significant degree. So I'd say that's a big factor to keep in mind, just in terms of how vulnerable is it really causing the characters to feel. And you can do a story, I mean, if you set up schematically a story to be primarily about psychological danger, just set that up right from the beginning. You could say this person's memories are going to drive this person to do something. Then schematically you have a ratcheted down sort of presence of danger. And you could certainly do that in a very different type of story. But when you've had 5 stories where the danger is very, very present and is not a psychological danger, it's going to be sort of underwhelming to then displace it from basilisks and dragons and that sort of thing to memories. So I think that's a big factor in why that's the first half especially is more forgettable. It's forgettable for me at least, but in diagnosing what causes that, we can recognize how those factors will play out in the story. But that's the Half-Blood Prince. Also, the Half-Blood Prince thing that echoed a lot the diary in book 1, so that's felt like a second try at a plot point that she was attempting in book 1, and I think book 2. And I think this was not a complaint about book 2. Book 2 is probably my least favorite one. But book 2 I would say, just the analogy of the 90s Western movies, book 2 is much more like the Wild Wild West of the series, because it feels like a lot of what she's doing is attempting things that just don't quite work. And, I definitely appreciate that. I appreciate in book 2 the experimentation of, how much am I really going to ramp up the danger? And I think part of the problem with book 2 is it ramps up the danger way, 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 way high. It goes, from just being a story of a boarding house to being kids are gonna get eaten by this giant snake monster, and Harry wins by stabbing a snake monster in the head. So, and I think that's part of the brilliance of book 3 is that she was able to course correct and sort of ratchet down the danger a bit, where the most dangerous thing is a dog and a rat. So she goes, really effectively goes from a giant snake monster that Harry stabs with a sword to a dog and a rat being the biggest dangers. And the Dementors, certainly the Dementors. Dementors are very much, sort of a ratcheted down, more of a menacing sort of a danger than just a giant monster danger. So it sort of recapitulates, it's like attempt number 2 at the diary thing in the Half-Blood Prince. And I think the whole Half-Blood Prince subplot thing, I think it works really well, but just in direct contrast to the theme and variation was a detriment to it really working effectively. I think if we just had that Half-Blood Prince plot in just a standalone book, it would have been just this mind-blowingly amazing plot point. Everybody would remember that. But because it comes right on the heels, if you compare the Half-Blood Prince plot to Umbridge, which is just so fantastically menacing and well constructed, sort of a direct danger where Harry's bleeding from the hands versus he's got these interesting spells like this, the spell where he makes Malfoy bleed. I mean, that certainly is a part that works really effectively. But is that danger to Harry? I mean, it's sort of taking Harry's being made to bleed as a punishment versus he has this spell that makes Malfoy bleed at a point where we kind of want that to happen. And just a pet peeve of mine is the prefaces outside of the POV of Harry. I have this fixation on POV, and if it were me, I would just cut out the sections in the POV of somebody else. In Half-Blood Prince, it's in the POV of Snape, and it sets up everything, and it sort of undermines the suspense of whether or not. I mean, I think that's a big issue too. Is Malfoy a Death Eater? Well, yeah. I mean, it kind of sets that up right at the beginning of Deathly Hallows, so it sort of undercuts that. And it makes it extra absurd that nobody would believe Harry when he says Malfoy's up to something horrible. But anyway, there's Half-Blood Prince. One more book to go. Then we'll see what series we start next. See you on the next episode.